Most shipwreck stories end the moment the ship goes down. That's usually the part people remember. The storm, the rocks, the screams, the freezing water, the desperate fight to stay alive. But the Batavia story is different. In fact, that's exactly why it stayed with me. Because in this story, the shipwreck is not the worst part. Not even close. The real horror begins after the survivors reach land. And I'm telling you right now, if someone had pitched this to me as a movie script and claimed it was based on real events, I probably would have said, okay, that's too much. That sounds exaggerated. But it happened, and the more I read, the worse it got. A Dutch ship is wrecked off the coast of Australia in 1629. Hundreds survive. They make it to a chain of small, barren islands. There is almost no fresh water, not enough food, no real shelter, and no clear idea when rescue might come. That alone is already a nightmare. But then one of the survivors, Jeronimus Cornelisz, starts building his own little kingdom out there. And the way he does it is by manipulating people, isolating anyone who might resist him, and slowly turning survival into systematic murder. And this is the part where I really stopped and just stared at the page for a minute. Because these weren't people trapped with some supernatural evil. They were trapped with another survivor. A man who had been on the same ship. A man who also should have been focused on getting everyone through the crisis alive. Instead, he saw opportunity. I grew up in a family where history was never treated like a list of dates. The question was always, what kind of person sees chaos and decides to become its master? That's what grabbed me here. Because Batavia is not just a disaster story. It's a story about what happens when authority collapses and the wrong person steps into the vacuum. So let's back up a little. The Batavia was a ship of the Dutch East India Company, the VOC, one of the most powerful trading companies in the world at the time. This wasn't some tiny fishing boat. This was a major commercial vessel sailing from the Dutch Republic toward Batavia, modern-day Jakarta, in the East Indies. On board were soldiers, sailors, merchants, passengers, women, children, luxury goods, silver, and all the tension you'd expect when hundreds of people are crammed together on a long ocean voyage, with hierarchy, money, fear, and ambition all mixing in one wooden box. And if there's one thing history teaches over and over again, it's this. When a system looks stable from the outside, that doesn't mean the people inside it aren't already starting to crack. The ship had a commander, Francisco Pelzert, a senior company official. Then there was the skipper, Arjen Jacobs, who handled navigation and sailing. And then there was Jeronimus Cornelisz, an under-merchant, not a captain, not a soldier, not the man technically in charge. But this is important. People don't always need official power if they know how to influence the people around them. Cornelisz is one of those historical figures who makes me deeply uncomfortable because he doesn't sound like a wild madman from the beginning. He sounds intelligent, educated, persuasive, the kind of man who could speak calmly while thinking very dangerous thoughts. Before the voyage, he had been an apothecary. He had experienced personal and financial troubles. There are also indications he had become involved with heterodox ideas and was already standing a bit outside normal social and religious boundaries. And I mention that carefully because I don't want to turn this into fake psychological certainty. We can't diagnose a man from the 17th century, but we can say this. He was not stable in the way you'd hope a crisis leader would be stable, and somewhere along the voyage, a mutiny plot seems to have been forming. That alone is already incredible. Because Batavia wasn't just unlucky after the wreck. It may have been carrying danger long before it hit the reef. Evidence suggests Cornelisz and skipper Jacobs were involved in plans to seize the ship, which likely would have meant violence against key officers and possibly against passengers. So when the ship later wrecked, Cornelisz did not suddenly transform from a normal man into a monster overnight. The conditions changed, but the ambition was already there. That detail matters to me, because a lot of terrible historical events don't create evil from nothing. They simply remove the barriers that were holding it back. In June 1629, the Batavia struck the Morning Reef in the Houtman Abrolhos Islands off the western coast of Australia. Imagine the scene. Night, confusion, a major ship grounded on a reef, waves pounding the hull, people waking up in panic. Some can't swim, some don't know where their families are, some are praying, some are screaming, some are already trying to save themselves. If you've ever been in a crisis, you know how quickly order can disappear. Now multiply that by hundreds, in darkness, on a breaking ship, in the 17th century. Around 300 people survived the wreck and reached nearby islands. But calling them islands probably makes them sound kinder than they were. These were harsh coral outcrops, dry and exposed, with little fresh water. No forests, no easy food supply, not some tropical paradise where survivors could relax under palm trees and wait for rescue. This was survival territory from the first hour. And here's where the story takes its first major turn. Pelsaert, the senior official, decided to leave the islands in a longboat with a small group to search for water and then attempt the nearly impossible journey to Batavia to bring back rescue. On paper, that decision makes sense. Someone had to get help. The survivors could not remain there forever. But once Pelsaert sailed away, guess who was left behind among the survivors? Cornelisz. That's the moment I keep coming back to, because if you were writing this story, that's the scene you'd underline in red. The official authority departs. The manipulative man remains. The islands are cut off from the world. Everyone is afraid. Food is uncertain. Water is scarce. And now leadership becomes less about rank and more about who can control the group. Cornelisz had a problem, though. He was ambitious, but he wasn't stupid. He knew that not everyone would follow him, especially not the soldiers. So one of the first things he did was cleverly get rid of the people most likely to resist him. He sent a group of soldiers led by Weeby Hayes to search for water on another island. And when I first read that, I thought, okay, that sounds practical, that sounds reasonable. Send strong men to scout resources. But then I realized what was really happening. He wasn't just sending out a search party, he was removing opposition. That's one of the reasons this story is so chilling. The violence doesn't begin with dramatic screaming madness. It begins with administrative thinking. Separate the dangerous people. Control the weapons. Isolate the loyal from the disloyal. That's not random chaos. That's method. Once he had reduced the number of people around him who could push back, Cornelisz started organizing power. He gathered followers. He offered some men privileged status. He turned fear into a tool. And then the killings began. At first, people disappeared one by one. Some were told they were being transferred. Some were sent away and never returned. Others were murdered more openly. Cornelisz's followers killed men, women, and children. Let that sink in. Not enemy soldiers, not mutineers in self-defense, survivors of the same shipwreck. People who had done nothing except remain vulnerable. And this is where I really had to stop and ask myself, what were the followers telling themselves? Because Cornelisz didn't kill everyone personally. That's important. He needed accomplices. He needed ordinary men willing to obey him. Maybe some were afraid, maybe some were greedy. Maybe some thought aligning with the strongest man was the safest strategy. Honestly, probably all of the above. But that's exactly what makes the story disturbing. Once a manipulator convinces enough people that survival depends on him, other people begin doing his work for him. And it got worse. Cornelisz reportedly intended to reduce the number of survivors so that when a rescue ship eventually came, his group could overpower it more easily and seize control. Just imagine that level of calculation. Most people stranded after a shipwreck dream about rescue. This man was already planning how to turn rescue into piracy. Some women were kept alive because Cornelisz and his inner circle wanted to use them sexually. That part is horrifying in a very specific way because it shows this was no longer just about fear or food. It was domination. Total domination. He was creating a miniature terror regime in isolation, where he could decide who lived, who died, and who became property. And this is where I think the Batavia story stops being merely historical and starts feeling uncomfortably modern. We like to imagine tyrants as giant figures on national stages, but sometimes tyranny happens on a much smaller scale. A room, a camp, a shipwreck island. The mechanics are the same. Control information, remove opposition, reward loyalty, normalize cruelty, make resistance feel impossible. But here's the part Cornelius miscalculated. The soldiers he had sent away, especially Weeby Hayes, did not die. In fact, they found fresh water on another island, and once Hayes realized something was wrong, he did something that, honestly, I think is one of the most impressive acts of leadership in any survival story I've ever read. He didn't collapse, he didn't panic, he organized. Now, if Cornelisz is the dark center of this story, Hayes is the opposite. He wasn't a grand historical hero with a huge army. He was a soldier with a small group of men on a barren island, cut off from the rest, realizing they might be the next targets. And instead of surrendering to that fear, he built a defense. They made crude fortifications, what is often described as one of the earliest European structures in Australia. They armed themselves with what they had. They positioned lookouts. They prepared for attack. This is the moment in the story where I felt something I really wasn't expecting after page of horror. Relief. Because finally, somebody was resisting effectively. Cornelisz sent men against Hayes's group, expecting easy submission. Instead, they were beaten back. And that says so much. Terror feels invincible until it meets resistance. A man who can dominate starving, isolated survivors does not always remain powerful when someone says no and means it. Eventually, Cornelisz himself approached Hayes's island, reportedly during a parley or under circumstances where Hayes's men managed to seize him. And this is one of my favorite moments in the whole story, not because it's triumphant in some flashy Hollywood way, but because it proves something simple. Even after enormous damage has been done, a cruel system can still crack when enough people refuse to feed it. Cornelisz was captured, but the nightmare still wasn't over. Some of his followers remained armed, and the rescue ship had not yet arrived. Meanwhile, Francisco Pelzert had actually accomplished the impossible. He reached Batavia in an open boat, an astonishing journey in itself, and returned with a rescue vessel, the Sardam. Think about that. While this tiny island society was collapsing into murder and paranoia, somewhere else Pelzert was racing time across the ocean to save people he had no way of knowing were still alive. And when the Sardam finally appeared, the race was suddenly on, because whoever reached the rescue ship first would control the story. If Cornelisz's faction had succeeded in taking the ship, the entire disaster could have turned into something even bigger. But Hayes's men managed to warn the rescuers in time. That detail is huge. History sometimes turns on minutes, on who arrives first, on who gets to speak before the other side. Once the truth came out, Pelzert conducted an investigation on the spot. Now, I'll be honest, this is the kind of moment where modern people instinctively ask for courtroom procedures, lawyers, paper trails, all of that. But this was a 17th century crisis in the middle of nowhere, run by a trading empire. Justice was fast, brutal, and very public. Cornelisz and several of his followers were convicted. Some were executed on the islands themselves, others were taken away. Two mutineers were marooned on the Australian mainland, which is one of those historical details that sounds almost too strange to be real. And after all of that, after shipwreck, mass murder, resistance, rescue, and summary justice, the survivors were taken on to Batavia. But how do you survive something like that and ever return to ordinary life? That's the question I kept asking at the end. Not, who were the villains? That part is clear enough. I mean the survivors. The women who had been terrorized, the children who saw trusted adults vanish, the men who realized too late what was happening around them, the soldiers who had to build a tiny last stand on a remote island. What does safety even feel like after that? There's also another question that really stayed with me. Was Cornelisz uniquely monstrous, or was he only able to do what he did because the conditions allowed the worst parts of human nature to spread unchecked? I don't ask that to soften his guilt. Not at all. He bears responsibility for choices that were calculated, cruel, and deliberate. But history becomes more useful when we ask why other people followed him. Because if we reduce a story like this to one bad man did bad things, we miss the harder lesson. Bad men are most dangerous when enough frightened, selfish, or passive people decide it's safer to go along. And honestly, that's the real reason Batavia hit me so hard. The story begins as a maritime disaster, but it ends up exposing something much darker than a storm or a reef. It exposes how thin the line can be between order and predation when institutions vanish and survival becomes the only language people think matters. What would I like to believe about myself in that situation? I'd like to think I would have stood with Hayes. I'd like to think I would have recognized Cornelisz for what he was early enough to do something. But history has made me cautious about that kind of confidence. Most people don't imagine themselves as future followers of a dangerous man. They imagine they're just getting through the day, staying useful, staying safe, avoiding conflict. And sometimes that's exactly how evil scales up, through people who keep telling themselves they're not really part of it. So when people summarize the Batavia story by saying, it was a shipwreck where the survivors turned on each other, I think that misses the point. The survivors did not simply go mad. This wasn't random collapse. It was organized terror. It was ambition finding a vacuum. It was one man seeing vulnerable human beings, not as lives to protect, but as pieces to arrange. And maybe that's why the story still feels so modern. We like to believe civilization is a strong wall, but often it's more like a thin shell. Break the ship, remove the authority, isolate the group, add fear, scarcity, and one manipulative personality, and suddenly the question becomes not whether darkness appears, but whether anyone can stop it in time. In the end, what saved some of the Batavia survivors was not luck alone. It was resistance. Weeby Hayes and his men proved that even in one of the most desperate situations imaginable, courage still matters, organization matters, refusal matters. One group decided they would not be ruled by terror, and because of that, some people lived who otherwise almost certainly would have died. So if there's one line from this story that keeps echoing in my head, it's not "the ship went down." It's something much worse. They survived the shipwreck, and then had to survive each other. And maybe that is the most terrifying kind of history of all. Not the kind where nature destroys us. The kind where nature merely traps us long enough to reveal what some people were ready to become all along.